before we start, I want to draw your attention to the flag here. Does that look familiar, anybody? I bet it doesn't. I bet it
Isn't that the
doesn't.
first
No,
American
it's not something you normally would know.
Isn't that the first American flag?
Yeah, that's very good, Barry. That's correct. This is called the Grand Union flag, not associated with the grocery store that we know of. It was the official flag of the 13 colonies on July 4th when the Declaration was signed from England, or when they signed it, in response to the British. The design consisted of 13 stripes, alternately red and white, representing the 13 colonies with a blue field in the upper left-hand corner, representing the 13 colonies, bearing the red cross of St. George of England with a white cross of St. Andrews of Scotland. George Washington chose this flag to be flown to celebrate the formation of the Continental Army on New Year's Day, 1776. So by the time July 4th came around, that was the flag that was considered to be the first flag, as Barry has told us, that the United States. Okay, great. I assume Holly will be out in a little while. I want to welcome you all today to the meeting of the Monroe Historical Society. For those who don't know, this is behind me. This is called the Mapes House. When Neil Dwyer was village mayor, he bought the house. He wanted the house to be used for the office of the village historian and for the Monroe Historical Society. However, there's a change in administrations. We're not sure where we're headed. So please keep posted and stay in touch. And please feel free, if you're not already, to join the Monroe Historical Society and help us in our efforts to preserve the history around us. Something we should all do.
Paul?
Yeah.
When is the house date from?
1820s, early 1820s. It was owned by the Mapes House. The Mapeses were here for a very long time. In fact, not only did they own this house, they were involved in the leadership of the First Presbyterian Church in Monroe, and they actually, the recent family, had Julie Mapes in school, and her parents ran the used tool place in Monroe for a while near where the U-Haul is, and then I think they finally moved out of the area. So anyway. All right, so this is the first of 5 talks that I'm giving to celebrate America's 250th birthday. The others will follow generally once a month on topics related to the nation's early years as both the new republic and a fledgling new democracy. In 1837, New England poet Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote the following line in his poem Concord Hymn. As a tribute to those patriots who fought against British tyranny, he said, "Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard around the world." That occurred, of course, at Lexington and Concord. At Concord Bridge in 1775, no one would have understood how prophetic those words would become. These brave men who engaged the best professional trained army on the globe in April 19, 1775 would not be aware that they had initiated what would become the world's first modern republic, based on a document that declared self-rule over monarchy and claimed universal basic human rights for many, but not all, of its citizens. The views in the sacred document would have a worldwide impact on people well into the 20th century. Our story begins with a brief summary of the causes of the American Revolution, and then follows the drafting, discussion, debate, and finally the legacy that the Declaration of Independence left to us and future generations of Americans, along with citizens of the world. When the British formed its American colonies, it was understood, at least by the British, that they existed to benefit the mother country by providing raw materials in exchange for British finished goods. Backed by acts of Parliament, the colonies enjoyed the protection of the British Navy, received bounties, financial bonuses for additional colonial resources. Due to geographic distance, the colonies created their own colonial assemblies to regulate themselves, as long as their actions didn't violate British law. Occasional illegal trade with France or Spain occurred, but were widely ignored by the British under the view of salutary neglect, as England was engaged in conflicts back in Europe. So England had a lot on their plate. They decided that we were so far away, let the colonies see what happens, let's see what goes, but we have to focus on what we have to focus on. until the bill comes, basically. Let's see. While under British control, American colonists, white male property owners at least, were guaranteed the rights of Englishmen, which included trial by jury, due process of law, writs of habeas, right to habeas corpus, and right to tax themselves, either by direct consent or by their elected legislature. Everything changed when the British and Iroquois defeated the French and Hurons during the French and Indian War. Ending in 1763, the conflict resulted in doubling the area of the 13 colonies as far west as the Mississippi River. England took control of Canada, which Voltaire, by the way, said was nothing more than a few acres of snow. While France ceded Louisiana and New Orleans to Spain, unfortunately for the victor, this is England, the national debt doubled as well, and the British Crown needed income to pay off its war debt. So England's boundary has now been doubled. It was the Appalachian Mountains, and now it's the Mississippi River. With the expansion of its empire in North America, England's defense costs for their territory also rose, frustrating Americans looking to settle beyond the mountains. The resultant taxes placed on the colonies created resistance to parliamentary authority and rising hostility to the king. From 1765 to 1774, Acts of Parliament and ever-increasing restrictions on perceived colonial freedoms created the conditions which led to armed conflict by 1775 and moved Americans toward independence. Among the new important taxes were, and these are, I'm sure, hopefully familiar to you, the Stamp Act of 1775, which put a tax on official documents and legal things, as well as dice and playing cards. The Townshend duties of 1767 and the Tea Act of 1763. Leading colonists pointed out that this type of tax were illegal, and they're talking about now the stamp tax on local documents and things, must come from their own duly elected colonial legislatures. And that was their view at the time. Let's see. And not from Parliament where they were not represented. For those who aren't aware, England said that they were represented as something called virtual representation, where even though you don't have the right to vote, the government affects your lives, so you have virtual representation even though you can't vote for them. But remember, in the colonies now, they were left alone. They chose their own legislatures. When the Stamp Act failed to raise the required revenue, Parliament turned to taxes on key colonial imports, while ever increasing control on any illegal foreign trade. So long salutary neglect, they can't afford to do that anymore. While canceling the Stamp Act, Parliament insisted through its passage of the Declaratory Act of 1766 that it kept its prerogative to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So they claimed that even though they removed this tax, they still had the right to tax. So again, the Townshend duties placed tariffs to be paid by colonial consumers on important colonial imports such as glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Once again, Parliament repealed those taxes except for the tax on tea because of its popularity with colonial women. That women were so addicted to British tea that they would nag their husbands and tell them to quiet down and stop rabble-rousing. Yeah, but it became a symbol for Parliament's right to tax the colonies. After the Tea Act granted a monopoly to the East India Tea Company, impacting the business of colonial merchants and consumers, protests and boycotts occurred. The most consequential protest was the Boston Tea Party. If you've seen Larry David's version of the Boston Tea Party last night, that was a hoot and a half. When on December 16th, members of the Sons of Liberty, although I'm sure the British called them Sons of something else, dressed up as Mohawk Indians and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston harbor. England responded to this act of destruction with the Intolerable or Coercive Acts that closed the port of Boston, suspended the Massachusetts Assembly, replaced local officials with royal ones, allowed the quartering of British troops in private homes, and shipping those accused of crimes in the colony back to England for trial. As word of these British responses to colonial events spread via the colonial press and committees of correspondence in major cities, colonial representatives gathered in Philadelphia in 1774 as part of what's known as the First Continental Congress. While taking no action in regard to independence, it encouraged unified colonial economic resistance, such as boycotts, and restated colonial loyalty to the king while pleading for a redress of grievances. In other words, we're still loyal to you, but please knock it off. How about repealing the Intolerable Acts? When that appeal failed, the delegates agreed to meet the following spring in May of 1775. That's the Second Continental Congress. Now, by the time the Second Continental Congress met in May of the next year, armed conflict had already broken out at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The New England colonies gathered local militias to assist in the cause. Initially, and without any guidance from Congress, colonial patriots seized British stores, removed royal officials, and stalled the deployment of British troops from taking control of Boston. 3 days before the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Second Continental Congress voted to create the Continental Army out of the militia units formed around Boston and unanimously approved the motion to make George Washington of Virginia its commanding general. On June 17, 1775, colonial militias once again distinguished themselves during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Even though that battle was declared a British victory, Massachusetts Minutemen, aided by their neighbors from New England, withstood 2 direct British assaults and only withdrew when they ran low on ammunition. As a result, the Second Continental Congress took a new role, that of a functioning, illegal, ad hoc government, coordinating military strategy and finding a new army while attempting to both reconcile with England and continue resistance to unfair British policies. Tough to have it both ways, right? It justified the reasons for taking up arms while again pleading with the king in order to prevent further conflict. This was the Olive Branch Petition. They said, let's have peaceful activities. But by this time, George was informed about the Olive Branch Petition. He had already declared elements within his North American colonies in open and armed rebellion and refused to receive the petition. He also directed that Hessian mercenaries be sent to put down the revolt. So he wasn't taking any grief from the colonies. So while it appeared that mainly New England colonies were the ones at war with Great Britain, events elsewhere also raised hostility to the crown and increased a call for a complete break with England. On November 1st, 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that offered freedom to Negroes of all owners in Virginia if they enlisted to fight under his command. Dunmore had grown sour over colonial protests of British policies and wished to punish those who resisted his authority and his subsequent declaration of martial law. But now what he's done is he said any Negroes in Virginia, so he's not only angered the people who are thinking about, hostility toward Great Britain, but now those who support Great Britain may also lose their slaves to this fight. Lacking a sizable number of British troops to carry out his wishes on land, Dunmore set up headquarters on a British ship just off the coast. Dunmore's proclamation upset many well-to-do Virginians like George Washington, who feared that an army of slaves with guns would threaten both the livelihoods and the lives of Virginia planters, many of whom were loyalists. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina believed that it did more to create a desire for independence than anything else up to this point. South Carolina was heavily a slave colony at this point. So on January 1st, 1776, Dunmore fired cannons on the key port of Norfolk in an effort to destroy the city's important commercial structures. After British troops landed and continued the destruction of buildings, Patriot forces completed the job so that nothing was left for the British to confiscate. Note, if the buildings belonged to loyalists, Patriots cleaned them out for themselves when you're in Rome. In the spring of 1776, news of British invasions of Boston and Norfolk were commonplace in the colonies. There were fewer calls now for reconciliation, and more calls for American independence. In Congress, colonial legislatures had not given their delegates specific instructions on how to vote and were free to vote their own conscience. One complication to the process was that delegates changed frequently. Delegates sometimes came. They came for 6 months. They went back. They worked their farms if they had them. They came back, or other delegates were sent. But regardless of what delegates were there at the Second Continental Congress, each colony, soon to be state, would have only one vote. That's the way it worked. As England increasingly blocked colonial trade on the high seas, Congress legalized the seizure of British goods and ships while opening trade with other foreign nations. By the end of April 1776, North Carolina became the first colony outside of New England to vote for independence, and both Georgia and South Carolina gave permission for the creation of state governments if independence passed. So now we're moving toward that direction. Another major factor in building support for the Revolution was due to the efforts of Thomas Paine. Paine had arrived in America only 2 years before the Declaration of Independence at the age of 37. Settling in Philadelphia, he was the editor and author of Pennsylvania Magazine. Initially, Paine's writings included observations that many Americans loved Great Britain, but were angry with its government. For Paine, the turning point was Lexington and Concord, which brought the American cause before a higher court, one that was above the court of mankind. Using logic and passionate language, Paine made his case for American independence in his revolutionary pamphlet, Common Sense. So let's just pause for a second then, and let's take a look at your first handout. It says Tom Paine, Plain Arguments for Independence. Well, what I've done is I've attached an excerpt from it, but I've shorted them down so that we don't have to go over the whole thing, certainly. But let's take a look. We'll go to page 389. The first box begins with the words, "The sun. The sun never shone on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part the habitable globe." So in other words, he's really talking about how much this is going to affect the world. Go to box number 2 at the bottom of the next page, 390. "But Britain is the parent country, say some, then the more shame upon her conduct. Even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their families." So he's really now twisting the emotional knives by using the word brute and savage. "Wherefore, if the assertion, if true, turns to her reproach, but it happens not to be true, or only partly so, and the phrase parent or mother country hath been Jesuitically adopted by the king and his parasites, blood-sucking parasites, the king and his friends, with a low papistical design." There's a twist that aimed at those who might feel friendly toward the Catholic Church, as if there's no response back. Whatever the king or pope says is what you do, in an attempt to gain an unfair bias on the weakness of our mind. "Europe and not England is the parent country of America." Turn the page 391. The New World has been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of, not from the tender embraces of the mother, but from the cruelty of the monster. So it's not the mother country, it's the monster in charge. Right? He's really trying to build a cause here. Look at excerpt 3. "Any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels. Remember, at this time, England is fighting the French in a series of 4 wars England fought with France during the 1700s, and sets us at variance with nations we would otherwise seek our friendship, and against whom we have neither anger nor complaint." In other words, they're going to draw us in to a conflict involving other countries, which is only going to harm us and put us at risk. Quote number 4, excerpt 4. "Everything that is right or natural pleads for separation. The blood of the slain the weeping voice of nature cries its divine heart. Page 393 at the bottom. And now he really talks about, the issue of what it's like to try to govern a continent. He said, it is repugnant to reason and the universal order of things, to all examples from former ages, to suppose that this continent can long remain subject to any external power. As the bottom of the page, here's where the government comes in. As the government matters, it is not the power of Britain to do this continent justice. The business of it will soon be too weighty and intricate to be managed with any tolerable degree of convenience by a power so distant from us and so very ignorant of us. For if they cannot conquer us, they cannot govern us. To always be running 3,000 or 4,000 miles with a tale or petition, just like the Olive Branch petition. By the time the king got it, he already declared us at war, and he said, throw the Olive Branch petition out the window. Which, waiting 4 or 5 months for an answer, when obtained, requires 4 or 6 to explain it, will in a few years be looked upon as folly and childishness. There was a time when it was proper, and there was a proper time for it to cease. Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care, but there is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In no instance has nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. He just talks about the logistics of trying to do this. Okay? On the right-hand column on 394, we're almost finished with this, just a couple left. No man has a warmer wish for reconciliation than myself. Before the fatal 19th of April, 1775, but the moment the event of that day was made known, it rejected the hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England forever, and disdained the wretch that with the pretended title father of his people can unfeelingly hear of their slaughter and composedly sleep with their blood upon his soul. He's pretty tough language. Okay, all right. And speaking of the king, well, if this rings true for anybody, it says in the end of the first paragraph on 395, the king, the greatest enemy which this country has or can have, shall tell us there shall be no laws but such I like. In other words, it's up to me. You don't like it, talk. Right? And then lastly, about colonial government, the assemblies, page 396, second column, end of the first paragraph. Let the assemblies be annual with president only, the representation more equal, their business wholly domestic and subject to the authority of the Continental Congress. Basically saying that it really should be the duty of the Congress to deal with colonial legislatures, not the president. 397, but where, say some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, my friend, he reigns above and does not make havoc or mankind like the royal brood of Great Britain. So God is our king. Interestingly enough, for a guy that questioned God's existence at one point later on in his writing, if you ever read Thomas Paine, Abraham Lincoln became a real fan of Thomas Paine and started thinking along those lines, and then politically he realized that was not the thing to say, and then eventually grows in his own thing. Anyway, all right, but I digress. At the very end, O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom has haunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England has given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. So, pretty persuasive arguments. And it's Thomas Paine's work as it carries throughout the colonies that will in fact spread that word. A little bit about the pamphlet itself. It was published in January of 1776. It sold out quickly. It was then printed again in 120,000 additional copies 3 months later. Members of Congress read it and discussed it and even sent copies home, like Middletown resident and New York delegate Henry Wisner. Henry Wisner's buried in Middletown, by the way. George Washington read portions of it to his troops. Paine devoted 50% of his profits from the sale of Common Sense to assist soldiers. He also served in the Continental Army as an aide-de-camp to General Nathaniel Greene. Paine's appeal for independence was primarily an attack on the king, an assault on the divine right to rule, and a call for popular representative government that protected people's individual liberties. Such a change, Paine believed, could impact the world for generations to come. Always an advocate for independence, John Adams, in May of 1776, began writing about the necessary structure of new state governments once independence became a reality. Along with Edward Rutledge and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, Adams was appointed by the Second Continental Congress to a committee created for that purpose. As he suggested the specific details for such governments, he favored written state constitutions that rejected both royal and parliamentary control over their affairs. He recommended 3 branches of government: an elected governor with a veto and term limits, a 2-house legislature to make laws, and an independent judiciary. Powers invested in a national government were those that only a national government could effectively administer. Rules regarding international trade, defense, mail, land claims, and disputes among the states. While these details were being worked out, Adams believed that a national declaration of independence would greatly enhance America's chances for success by uniting the states and its people while demonstrating our intentions to both King George and other nations of the world whose assistance we might need, such as France and Spain. Unfortunately for Adams, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland rejected Adams's resolution on state governments. Pennsylvania was dominated by Quaker pacifists and was still a proprietary colony, loyal to the king. By the way, on a side note, I was talking to somebody who lived in Cornwall, and they said, what role did Cornwall have in the American Revolution? They said none. Why? Because they were all Quakers, and Quakers were pacifists. Anyway, interesting side note. I heard that the other day. All right. And Pennsylvania was still a proprietary colony loyal to the king. Several delegates like Ben Franklin were skilled artisans who favored independence. To obtain independence, unanimity among the colonies was required to avoid a civil war that still came anyway. Faced with this dilemma, Franklin led the creation of a provincial convention that replaced the colony's proprietary government with a representative government that supported independence. On June 17th, it went into effect and promptly approved its support for independence. As the Patriot cause gained momentum, events in various colonies created friendships among the Continental Army, members of the Continental Army who hailed from different regions. And once Pennsylvania approved independence, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland allowed its delegates to vote for it. The only colony left to voice its support for independence was New York, whose delegates believed they could not vote for independence without the approval of the state legislature, which never sent any. New York abstained until July 9th, when the state legislature finally sent word from White Plains for approval. If you've ever seen, how many have seen 1776, the musical? Right. Lewis Morris is from New York, and he said, John Hancock says, Mr. Morris, what in hell goes on in New York? And he goes, Mr. President, have you ever been to a meeting of the New York legislature? They talk very fast and very loud, and as a result, nobody listens to anyone. As a result, nothing ever gets done. Oh,
Still happens.
yeah, I just think, right? Anyway, all right, so on June 11th now, this is a month before the Declaration, more or less 3 weeks, the Second Continental Congress appoints a committee of 5 to draft the Declaration from Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Ben Franklin of Pennsylvania, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Jefferson was the document's author and often reviewed it before sending it out of committee for consideration before the whole body on June 28, 1776. While the Resolution on America's Independence was introduced by Virginia's Richard Henry Lee, the vote was delayed until July 1 so that each colony could have the time to free their representatives to vote for independence. Before his arrival to the Second Continental Congress in May, Jefferson had been working with Richard Henry Lee and George Mason on Virginia's own state constitution. That's another reason why the delegates were often back and forth. They were doing lots of things. After the state legislature approved its resolution on independence, both a new Virginia state constitution and a Declaration of Rights were written. Many specific ideas and concepts from these two documents would be adopted in some way or form into the Declaration, which is one I mentioned briefly now. Virginia's Declaration of Rights frequently drew inspiration from the ideas expressed by British philosopher John Locke, such as all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights, among which are the enjoyment of life, liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and attaining happiness and safety. Other specific rights were mentioned were individual liberty, jury trials, free elections, no excessive bail, freedom of the press, and free exercise of religion. Note, a revision was done. Natural rights applied only to those who enter into a state of free society. So slaves were excluded from the Virginia Constitution for that very reason. Again, if you want a law, you want to tailor it to what meets your needs, and that's what they were doing here. Virginia state constitution developed by Mason and had some of the same structural elements as suggested by John Adams in his Thoughts on Government, a bicameral legislature chosen by property owners, a governor, no veto power, and most state judges selected by the legislature. The preamble to the Virginia Constitution was written by Jefferson and often reflected his 1774 work, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. In it, he identified violations of American rights that would also end up in the Declaration. The only major change that he made to that later document was to single out the king rather than Parliament in order to build popular support for independence. For example, he labeled the king a tyrant for dissolving legislative houses repeatedly, burning our towns, a reference to Norfolk, prompting our Negroes to rise up in arms against us, Dunmore's proclamation, endeavoring to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, and sending a large army of foreign mercenaries, Hessians, to kill us. It also referred to the king's attempts, with assistance from Parliament, to impose taxes upon us without our consent and impose limits on colonial settlement west, and claiming absolute authority over. When Jefferson's draft of the Declaration was presented to his committee and then finally to the Second Continental Congress, its preamble was left virtually intact. It became the part most famous and often quoted, the one that later generations remembered best and quoted most. So let's take a look. Go to the second handout, your Declaration of Independence. We'll read the preamble. And by the way, it goes from the first bottom paragraphs on page 447 to the next page 448 and ends at the end of that longer paragraph. So let's take it. If you want to read with me, please join in. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and that accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over the states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world, and then he goes out and lays them. And when I used to do this with my students to discuss the next section, I want you to take a look and find out what word begins most of those later paragraphs. E. Right, that's his purpose, is to raise animosity toward the king in order to build the cause
I
of
thought it was
independence.
toward women. Sorry, I had
What's
to
that?
throw
Go ahead.
that. I said I thought it was toward women. I had to throw that in there. It was a joke.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah,
Or
sure.
It's always back then. It was always.
Okay, yeah. Hey, if Abigail Adams had written this, maybe she might have said that. Anyway, so that's it. As far as the preamble goes. We hold these truths originally were to be sacred and undeniable, but Ben Franklin revised it to mean to be self-evident or obvious. That all men are created equal and independent. This came from George Mason. The Declaration Committee and Congress changed the second half of that sentence to certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, government, that's Mason again, derive their powers from the consent of the government. If the government fails to do so, people have the right to alter or abolish it, was left unchanged. So a lot of what Jefferson had written was intact. Following the preamble, the Declaration then spells out all the grievances against England, its king, its parliament, and to a lesser degree, its people. While most were complaints repeated in Virginia's new Constitution, several new ones were added to reflect the unlawful, intolerable acts such as the quartering of British soldiers in private homes. As historian Edward Larson noted in his book, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters, and I have some books that I can recommend if you want to do more reading, the grievances section of the Declaration is often less appealing to us today. What happens is, in the American Revolution, the king will send the largest army England ever sent to another shore in its history up to that time. When the American Revolution, when the British decide to go and fight. All right. I do want to take the time, though, to read the concluding paragraph and just kind of get an idea of how the document finishes. It says, we therefore, this is on page 449 in your declaration, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish, declare that these united colonies are of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from their all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have the power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Wow. In the concluding paragraph, the Second Continental Congress added an appeal to the Supreme Judge of the world, and with firm reliance on divine protection of divine providence, and while declaring separation from Great Britain, it affirmed the powers of its own Congress to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and so on. Finally, the delegates there assembled pledged their support with their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. In doing so, they were now risking death sentences for committing treason against the British government. On July 1st, Congress took up the topic of Virginia's resolution on independence. John Adams at that time wrote, "May heaven prosper and the new republic make it more glorious than any other republic has done." The debate over independence lasted 2 days. During that time, word came from George Washington that the British were about to enter New York Harbor with more men and ships on the way. During the debate, Pennsylvania Representative John Dickinson feared that declaring independence now would make the British even more determined to put down the rebellion. Perhaps more preparation time was needed, he said. When the first vote was taken, 9 colonies supported independence. New York is still abstaining. Delaware voted yea after Caesar Rodney rode back from his home state to Philadelphia to cast that state's deciding vote. South Carolina voted yes when Rutledge received word that the British Navy was in Charleston Harbor. Pennsylvania voted yes after it failed to stop the resolution. The final vote was 12-0-1. The New York legislature finally sent its approval on July 9th. Better late than never. When all was said and done, about 25% of Jefferson's words were changed. As already noted, the king was the primary focus of colonial wrath. As Larson notes, it was a document for the ages, alterations and all. Jefferson, despite his career as a legislator, governor, ambassador, secretary of state, vice president, and 2-term president, the Declaration was the proudest achievement of his life. John Adams was so excited, they wanted his wife Abigail to read it as soon as possible. George Washington had it copied and read to his troops in New York. Copies were also sent out to the state legislatures to be shared with the public. Now, under normal circumstances, most legislative documents are not signed by those who vote for it. But these brave men wanted to make a point. They were putting their lives at risk. Note, no signer of the Declaration was ever executed or imprisoned for signing it. I mean, except for one. Actually, there was one who was arrested for signing it, but nobody was ever tried, convicted, or executed. Okay? And that happened to be, by the way, Richard Stockton of New Jersey was arrested for signing the document and was kept in prison in Provost Prison in New York City. He was granted parole and released after 5 months due to ill health. A condition of his parole was that he remain in peaceable obedience to the king. As a result, he had to resign from Congress. 4 other signers were captured during battle campaigns. Thomas Hayward of South Carolina, Arthur Middleton, Edward Rutledge, they were all seized during the siege of Charleston, and then George Walton was from Georgia was seized during the capture of Savannah in 1778. So, if the British had defeated the United States, the Declaration of Independence would have become only a wish, a dream created by some very bright guys, and certainly looked like the odds were slim for success in 1776. The British landed on Staten Island with a superior force soon to be joined by more troops and ships from Nova Scotia and Great Britain. Bloodshed was now inevitable, and Washington knew that he had to move quickly and avoid a fight that could end the dreams and hopes of the new nation. After moving his men out of Brooklyn into the Bronx and ultimately into New Jersey, he waited until he could make several strikes on his own against the enemy when he had the advantage. As a result, despite giving up New York City, he defeated the British and the Hessians at Trenton in Christmas night 1776 and at Princeton in January of 1777 when the Americans defeated, and finally when the Americans defeated General Burgoyne at Saratoga in the fall of 1777, it resulted in a treaty of alliance with France, whose aid and financial support made the difference in the revolution. I'm fortunate to note that not only I'm wearing the shirt of, I have my ancestor, John Crozier, who was at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, and served in Washington's Army at Brandywine and Monmouth. And on my, so he's my fourth great grandfather, and on my father's side of the family, my ancestor, Jonathan Hartwell, fought with the New Hampshire militia in helping American troops at Saratoga, and his name's listed on the battle record. So it's really, really pretty cool. This has been, by the way, a personal journey for me as well since I taught this stuff. With independence confirmed and by the British defeat at Yorktown in Virginia, 1781, our wish became reality. As John Adams predicted, fireworks became the norm everywhere on July 4th. As a result of American success, this principal document became an inspiration to people throughout the world for their right to determine their own futures for themselves and their families. From Latin American countries to our south, to the peoples of Europe, Asia, and Africa, our example was repeated by millions. The French modeled their own declaration of the rights of man after ours. Even Ho Chi Minh, communist leader of North Vietnam, used our document as a model in seeking relief from French control of Indochina. The promise of equality and the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness also inspired Americans of subsequent generations to broaden its meaning and relevance for their own time. I'd like to, at this point, bring in Abigail Adams. So if you can take a look at this, these are excerpts of the letters. And by the way, if you don't know, what's really great about this relationship is they were not only were they lovers, they were very good friends. They wrote to each other all the time, and they didn't destroy their letters. And they were kept, so that's why we're lucky we have them. So if you look at the second, the first is like an intro, but look at the first letter that Abigail writes to John in March of 1776. In the new code of laws, which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. This is great. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So they're saying the same things that we were telling the British. You don't give us any say, we're not going to follow what you want. That your sex, and here's where she kind of really tweaks at them, that your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us as only vassals of their sex. So she's really kind of telling them, men need to be careful about what they're doing. And so John writes to Abigail in April of 1776, as to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bonds of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were growing turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were growing discontented. So he's calling women a tribe.
Right.
Anyway, yeah. Anyway, and then she writes to John Adams in May, I cannot say that I wish you are very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very likable to be broken, and notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence, throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet, charmed by accepting, by submitting sway, yet have our humor most when we obey. So writing Abigail Adams did. She was the daughter of a minister. Puritans believed in educating men and women. She was well-spoken, well-written. It was just phenomenal.
And I think I just mentioned also before, I just read the book. It's called Founding Mother, a novel about Abigail Adams.
Oh.
And it's based on these letters.
These letters, yeah, they're
Yes,
wonderful.
yes.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Abolitionists, both black and white, made the case that slavery contradicted these precious tenets contained in our founding document. William Lloyd Garrison said that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document and wanted it burned. Frederick Douglass in 1853 gave a wonderful speech, or 55, on what is the 4th of July to the slave. It's a wonderful critique about how it's great for you, but look at what it's done for us. Anyway, in 1848 in Seneca Falls, female leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott demanded equal rights, including the vote, based on its words. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln gradually moved the country toward ending slavery and believed that everything he sought to accomplish as president sprang from his love of the Declaration of Independence and his respect for America's founders. And the only other, so if you take a look at the last thing I gave you, you have a list of other people that were involved that you probably might not see showing up elsewhere in discussions way back when. You see Abigail Adams in the upper left-hand corner. You see a Native American Oneida leader. I cannot pronounce his name, but he's there. James Armistead, enslaved African American who's gathered intelligence for the Continental Army. Corn planter, Seneca chief, and peace registrar between Native nations in the United States after the Revolution. This is, by the way, this is a copy of a collection of stamps that just came out by the post office. So you can get these. Yeah, you can get these. And then you have others too, like you have Alexander Hamilton, and in between him and Patrick Henry, Lemuel Haynes, military veteran and ordained minister who condemned African American enslavement. But you can see that again, our picture, from what we know now, is much broader and needs to be explained. The woman at the very bottom on the right, the second from right, Mercy Otis Warren, was a very good friend of Abigail Adams, lived on Cape Cod, and wrote a history of the American Revolution. So, really terrific. So, in conclusion, if we live in a world where the rule of law is suspect or even questioned, let us affirm our commitment on the 250th anniversary of our nation's birth to the fact that all people are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was only a dream in 1776. Let us continue to pay the debt of our founding fathers forward for ourselves and all mankind. Thank you very much. Let me just grab a sip of water. If you have anything you want to ask, I'll do my best to answer it if I can. Yes?
This might be a little off topic.
Don't worry about it.
Raise your hand.
But I read, I've been reading about the founding mothers. So I read about Patsy Jefferson, the daughter of Compton, and then I read about Hamilton's wife, and then Abigail Adams. Their politics were very different. Like Adams did not agree with Jefferson and Hamilton. What were the politics? Jefferson was a Federalist.
Well, that's going to happen later. I mean,
Okay.
their commitment to independence is here.
Right.
But what you're going to find out is their approach to government is going to be substantially different, because the people that ultimately support Jefferson becomes the Democratic Republican Party, which evolves to be the Democratic Party today, was very much opposed to a strong executive, worried about the strong national government as an becoming, and the potential for abuse. Patrick Henry speaks to that afterwards as well. And so, but the Federalists, as you'll see, like John Adams and later Hamilton, believe that the weak government created under the Articles is too weak to be effective. I mean, what happens is the Articles of Confederation are written in 1777, a year after the Revolution starts. They're not adopted until 1781. It takes them 4 years, and a lot of it has to do with who claims the territory beyond the Appalachians. Because if you look at borders of states back then, you had horizontal borders, and so when the Revolution claim everything west. And Connecticut's like, what about us?
Yeah,
And
we're
Rhode
stuck in
Island's
the
like,
middle.
what about
Yeah,
us?
go east.
And Delaware's like, what about us? So that's why ultimately they have to recognize the populations of the bigger states, but the rights of the smaller states. And under the Articles, it favors the smaller states, and so that's a problem, and so that's why they changed the document, because under the Articles, you needed all 13 states to approve change, and then they changed it to 9, for new constitution, they changed it to 9, 3/4 instead of all 100, all 100%. That way they can get their, that's what they do. You change the rules. You want something done, you change the rules. Sure.
Yeah, along those, so just to clarify, you referred to that the French Indian War was when England got the all
bill
that
really
properties.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But that did not include what was the Louisiana Purchase, right? Right.
No, that had been given to Spain.
So how far south did it go when they got? You said like west of the mountains, but to the Mississippi River. How far south?
New Orleans and Louisiana go to Spain, and then France will get it back from them in around
But
1800.
all those other states.
And then they're going to sell it.
So it's just New Orleans and Louisiana.
Yeah, right. That's the border now. So the question is, states that what under the Articles, what they do is to create new states, because they were thinking about, well, do these big states have the right to just extend their borders to the Mississippi and dominate everything? So what they decide to do is to create a law to create new states out of that territory, south and north of the Ohio River, and that becomes a debate because northern states don't want to see slavery expanded, southern states want to see slavery expanded, so you got that going on.
But not Texas. Texas was separate because we didn't get them that until
Texas doesn't
the
come
Mexican.
up until later, but the idea of settling the area and wanting to expand really applies, especially when what's the, I'm trying to think of the phrase, short staple cotton was developed. Then Texas becomes the
Curious about the timeline of after the Declaration
Right.
was made, and then the actual, I guess, war itself.
War ends in 1781 at Yorktown. So it starts in really, I date the revolution really to 1775, although there was a raid that was launched before the British went out toward Lexington in New Hampshire, where militias went in and took British weapons and supplies. That may have been the first conflict, even though I don't think a few people got killed, but they actually went in. Because there wasn't any Continental Army yet until a little bit later. And so these militias are acting, especially in New England, they're acting in concert with each other, but they're still state. But what's cool about New England, being relatively born in New England, is the New England states are all united in fighting the British, and they share information, and they unite together until Washington comes.
So is it correct to say that it took about 5 years for independence?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because independence means what? If you mean free from British control, then you can say pretty much 1783 is when the treaty was signed. The revolution ends in 1781, right, when the British are defeated at Yorktown, but there's 2 years where John Adams and others go over to England to negotiate the treaty, and then solve the treaty and establish the borders. And then from that moment on, in 1783, the United States is technically free of Great Britain. But the people that were really harmed by, you can say harmed by this, but certainly Native Americans were never brought into the discussion. And they were allies of the British. They were. The Iroquois. Yeah.
So, am I right? 82 people signed the Declaration of Independence?
56 signed it.
Oh,
56 signed the Declaration of Independence. 41 of those were slavery.
okay. And so there were 13 colonies.
Right.
Do they have to be one of those colonies, people from one of those colonies to sign it?
Well, here's what happens. The number of delegates is going to vary from colony to colony. The problem is because sometimes colonists go back. Jefferson went back because he was working on the Virginia Constitution. sometimes new folks come in. That's why they came up with the idea of one vote per state, regardless of the number of delegates. So the number of delegates doesn't mean as much. It's one vote per state that matters most. So the reason why Caesar Rodney has to go back from Delaware is because the one delegate opposes independence, and he has to go back so that the delegation can count their votes in favor of independence and not opposed or not abstaining.
So who decided who could sign it? Like,
They did. The Congress did.
The delegates that
The
were
delegates
there,
did.
that were there saying.
yeah.
The delegates decided who could sign, and they said, and they said if you're not supporting American independence, you can't sign the document. They knew that, and they all signed it, even though, like I said, under normal circumstances, an act of any Congress is never signed by the participants. But this one, they wanted to make sure that they put their names on it because they were committed.
Sorry, follow up
It's
to
okay.
the-
Yeah, sure.
to the
Yeah, go
Iroquois
ahead.
Limerick, but I'm assuming there were different tribes that either supported it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was true in the French and Indian War too. I mean, it's not the French and Indian War that's a misnomer. I used to tell people it's the French and some Indians versus the British and other Indians. So it was predominantly the British and the Iroquois versus the French and the Hurons, generally. And then you have tribes falling on either side depending on what was most at stake. I mean, the one reason why the Iroquois supported the British is because they didn't want the colonists to be pushing west either and pushing them out of their homeland. And eventually that's what happens. That happens all the time with settlers pushing west and being pushed out of their
Squatters'
homeland.
rights.
Huh?
Squatters' rights.
Yeah, right. Well, that's what it becomes.
That's what it started out with.
And then
in the
people
first
that have the majority who would develop their populations, I've seen that around here, right? Begin to dominate the process.
Well,
Yeah, Barry.
what year was evacuation day in New York City? I'm trying to put that into context.
Yeah, I'd have to look. I don't have it off the top of my head.
Evacuation, did you say?
Yeah, when after the war, British troops were still garrisoned in New York City
Oh.
for approximately 2 or 3 years. And I think wasn't it like
Oh,
1886, 1887 before they finally I'm sorry, 1776, 1787 before they finally
Oh,
left.
look. I'll look and see. Yeah. Anything else? You have the things? So to give you an idea what we're doing with this, on August 8th, which is going to be another Saturday, we assume it's going to be here. We'll let you know if you want. Keep looking at the events calendar. Is to do this. The next one will be on August 11th. That's going to be on the Revolution itself, the battles beginning with, the conflict in Massachusetts, and then major campaigns like Saratoga and Yorktown, those kinds of things. And then the third talk, and they're probably going to be like, we're trying to work it out once a month in September, but it's not the same day as the Cheese Festival. It'll be Benedict Arnold. And then the following month, it will be the Articles of Confederation, and finishing with the reasons for the development of the new Constitution. Yeah,
I have one more question.
sure.
Okay, I know that you taught history at Monroe Woodbury.
Right.
Actually two things. First of all, do they still teach all of this? And if you do know that, and number two, when you did teach it, which I assume probably was for a long time, did the kids get interested? What was their reaction? I'm just,
Let's see, is it still taught that? I can tell you the difficulty of teaching in New York State, and I don't think the curriculum's changed for U.S. history. It's teaching U.S. history and government in 1 year. Very difficult to do. I mean, there's a participation in government course for seniors, which I believe is still done, right? Where it's more about contemporary issues and events and those kinds of things. But it's very, very difficult to do it. You can't really do it justice. And that's the problem. When I taught in New Jersey, I was in New Jersey for 4. I loved it because I taught the first U.S. history from the origins all the way to Reconstruction, and in the senior year they got post-Reconstruction all the way to the present. You give me 2 years, I can. But I used to have to teach a lesson and say, I'm going to move through this quicker than Sherman went through Atlanta.
I mean, don't you think it's important? I mean,
Of course.
I don't think it's right that it's not being taught.
I know. Well, people get focused on other things. Oh, our math skills are weak, so they want people to be good in math. Math and science. Well, who are you going to get a job studying history? You know, other than teaching history. Oh, sorry.
Without history, we don't have
Anyway,
math and science, really. We don't have anything.
We all have
history.
generals we have to report to.
Do you touch on the
About
war?
the kids, I found some kids interested, and our job at the time was to hopefully figure out if they're interested now, that they stay with it, and if they're not interested when they're taught it, maybe when they get older they'll go back and think about it later on. Because you never know when you're teaching high school students, you never know what their lives are going to turn out like, but it's nice to know you've made those connections, and hopefully it comes back. I mean, I think Michael is still a good close friend of mine, still.
My daughter's 32 and the other one is 30.
Yeah.
You're still their favorite teacher. I said, I'm coming here. He, really? I said, yep.
Oh, that is
Yeah, I mean,
amazing.
I've been out for 10 years, but I still love the subject, and there isn't anything that I don't want to talk about or learn. And just, carry that passion with me, and hopefully some pick it up. Hopefully you'll pick it up. And by the way, I need to make an appeal here also. If you're not a member, please consider joining the Monroe Historical Society. We really need your support. We're trying to do some things that we can keep, where we can preserve the history and the buildings around us. Because if we're not careful, Monroe is going to end up looking, I say this is my comparison, Monroe's going to end up looking like Liberty in York. So, anyway,
Not good what's happening.
no.
Not good.
No. Anyway.
Do you touch on the War of 1812 when you talk about the battles, or that's
Yeah,
a
I
whole
did the War of
different-
I did the
Okay.
War of 1812. The thing that I found as I got older, it wasn't enough just to talk about these places. I had to go see
Had to
them.
go.
So when I went out west and went to, at that time it was Custer National Battlefield. I wanted to see where George Armstrong Custer fell. I wanted to see those places that I had talked about so much. My thrill going out west was seeing where the Golden Spike, it's not there because it's in the Huntington Museum in California, but the site where the two railroads met in 1869, the Union and Central Pacific. You go out that way, you can drive your car in the railroad bed because the tracks aren't there anymore. That line is not operational, but you can drive around the park. So, take it seriously, get your kids to talk about it, take your grandchildren to historic places, and spread the news. The history matters, and it's important, and it's fun. And if you read enough, you get to learn all sorts of things. I'm trying to think of something funny that I read recently. Anyway.
I have to,
Sure.
when you said government with history, when you're teaching it,
Right.
does theology get in there somehow?
Well, you can. I mean, in terms of, when we would talk about the Bill of Rights, we certainly would talk about,
I know.
freedom of religion, freedom of the press, those kinds of issues, and talk about it. Religion, listen, you can't discuss early American history and not talk about
Without-
religion. You
yes.
can't talk about the Quakers. You can't talk about the Mormons. You can't talk. You have to.
Absolutely.
You'd have to talk about the who is it? The Puritans.
Absolutely.
Those things are all important. They're important to the people, and they do influence things. And you just have to be objective and be understanding and be open to discussing.